Maria Santos stood in the center of the great hall with her hands bound behind her back and her heart beating fast against her ribs. The blue-skinned aliens surrounded her in a perfect circle, and their large black eyes stared at her with cold hatred. She had known this day would come, but she had hoped she would have more time to help the sick children before they caught her. The Zephyrian High Council sat on tall chairs, made of some kind of silver metal that reflected the harsh white lights from above. Their leader was an old alien named Vexitar, who had skin like dark blue leather and scars across his face that told stories of many battles. He looked down at Maria with the same expression she had seen people use when they found insects in their food. "Dr. Maria Santos of Earth," Vexitar said in his deep voice that echoed through the hall, "you stand before this council accused of the most serious crime possible under our sacred laws." He paused and looked around at the other council members who all nodded their agreement. "You have touched the untouchables and tried to heal those who carry the curse in their blood." Maria lifted her chin and looked directly at the alien leader, even though her legs shook with fear. She had spent 3 years studying Zephyrian culture, and she knew exactly what they meant by untouchables. These were children born with genetic differences that the Zephyrians believed made them cursed by their gods. Instead of helping these children, Zephyrian society kept them locked away in dark places where they slowly died from diseases that could be easily cured. "I helped sick children," Maria said in a voice that was stronger than she felt. "That is what doctors do. We heal people who need healing." The council members made angry sounds and their skin changed from blue to a darker purple color that Maria knew meant they were very upset. Vexitar held up one long finger to make them quiet, and then he smiled at Maria. But it was not a kind smile. "You humans always think you know better than cultures that are thousands of years older than yours," he said. "These untouchables carry the mark of divine punishment for sins committed by their ancestors. To heal them is to interfere with the will of our gods and to bring curse upon all who touch them." Maria had heard this explanation many times during her years on the Zephyrian homeworld. She had worked as a xenobiologist studying different alien species and their medical needs. When she first arrived, she had been excited to learn about Zephyrian medicine, which was very advanced in many ways. But then she discovered the terrible truth about how they treated their own children. The untouchables were not cursed by any gods. They simply had genetic conditions that made their skin look different, or caused them to be born without certain abilities that other Zephyrians had. On Earth, these children would receive treatment and live normal, happy lives. On the Zephyrian homeworld, they were hidden away and left to die. Maria had tried to work within their system at first. She offered to teach Zephyrian doctors how to treat the genetic conditions using methods that were common knowledge on dozens of other worlds. The doctors refused to listen. She tried to speak with religious leaders about showing mercy to innocent children. They told her that mercy would anger their gods. Finally, Maria could not watch any more children die when she had the knowledge and tools to save them. She began sneaking into the places where the untouchables were kept and secretly treating the sickest ones. For 6 months, she saved over 100 children who would have died without her help, but the Zephyrians had been watching her. They caught her in one of the underground chambers where she was giving medicine to a little girl whose genetic condition made her skin turn silver instead of blue. The girl could not have been more than 5 years old, and she smiled at Maria with such trust and hope that it broke Maria's heart to know she might never see her again. "You were warned many times to stop this forbidden behavior," Vexitar continued. "Yet you chose to ignore our laws and our customs. You chose to put your human arrogance above our sacred traditions." "I chose to save dying children," Maria replied. "If that makes me a criminal, in your eyes, then I accept that judgment." The other council members whispered among themselves in their own language, but Maria understood enough to know they were discussing her punishment. She had expected them to simply execute her or send her to prison for the rest of her life. But as she listened to their conversation, she realized they had something much worse in mind. Vexitar stood up from his tall chair and walked down the steps until he was standing directly in front of Maria. Up close, she could see that his black eyes had no warmth in them at all. They were like looking into deep caves where no light had ever been. "Death would be too easy for someone who has committed such terrible crimes," he said. "Instead, we have decided to send you to someone who will give you the punishment you deserve. We have hired the most feared hunter in the galaxy to track you down and make you pay for what you have done." Maria felt her blood turn cold. She had heard stories about alien bounty hunters who would chase their targets across star systems and never give up until they completed their contracts. Some of these hunters were known for their cruelty and their love of causing pain to their victims. "We are sending you to Jake Morrison," Vextar said with obvious pleasure in his voice. "The humans call him Apache because of his Earth heritage, but the rest of the galaxy knows him by a different name. They call him the Blood Hunter because he never fails to complete a contract and he never shows mercy to his targets." The other council members laughed and made happy sounds as they watched Maria's face turn pale. She had heard of Jake Morrison even though she had never met him. His reputation was known on every space station and trading post in the Outer Rim. He was said to be completely without fear or compassion, and he would track his prey through any danger to complete his job. "You think your human emotions and your soft heart make you better than us?" Vextar said. "Now you will learn what happens when those same emotions are turned against you. Morrison will hunt you down like the animal you are, and when he catches you, he will show you the same mercy you showed our sacred laws." Guards came forward and took Maria by her arms to lead her away from the council chamber. As they walked through the long hallways of the government building, she tried to think of some way to escape or some hope she could hold on to. But she knew that once the Zephyrians put her on a transport ship heading for Earth, her fate would be sealed. The transport pod was small and cold with just enough room for one person and supplies for a few days. The guard strapped Maria into the pilot seat and set the controls for automatic flight to Earth. Through the small window, she could see the Zephyrian homeworld getting smaller and smaller as the pod moved away into the darkness of space. As the stars surrounded her and the pod flew toward her doom, Maria thought about the silver-skinned little girl and all the other children she had tried to save. She did not regret what she had done, even though it was going to cost her life. Sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting terrible consequences, and Maria had always known this day might come. The pod flew on, through the emptiness toward Earth where Jake Morrison was waiting for her. In the dark corners of Nexus Station, where traders from 100 different worlds came to buy and sell things that were not always legal, beings spoke Jake Morrison's name in whispers. The station spun slowly in the void between 3 star systems, and its corridors were filled with the smell of exotic foods and the sound of languages that no human tongue could properly speak. Krex the Thalaxian sat in his usual booth at the back of the Nebula bar, and his forearms moved nervously as he told his story to anyone who would listen. His green skin had turned pale, and his large eyes kept looking around as if he expected death to walk through the door at any moment. "I saw him once on Kepler 7, Krex said in his clicking voice. There was this Vorthon war criminal who had been hiding in the deep caves under the northern continent. The local authorities had been trying to catch him for 3 years. But the caves went down for kilometers, and they were filled with poisonous gas and creatures that could eat through metal. The other aliens at the table leaned closer to hear the story. There was a Melody trader whose blue feathers rustled with excitement, and a Zarathi merchant whose tentacles curled and uncurled as he listened. These beings had traveled across the galaxy and seen many dangerous things, but stories about Jake Morrison always made them afraid. The bounty on this war criminal was enormous, Krex continued. Enough credits to buy a small moon. Dozens of hunters had tried to claim it, but none of them ever came back from those caves. Then Morrison arrived on Kepler 7 in his black ship, and he did not even ask for help from the local authorities. Krex paused to drink from his glass of fermented algae juice, and his hands shook as he lifted it to his mouth. The other aliens waited patiently because they knew that stories about the Apache were always worth hearing. Morrison went into those caves, alone with nothing but his weapons and some kind of breathing apparatus, Krex said. The locals thought he was insane, because no one could survive in that environment for more than a few hours. The gas would poison you and the creatures would tear you apart. But Morrison stayed down there for 6 days. The Melody trader made a sound that was like wind blowing through broken glass. 6 days in those caves? That is impossible. No being could survive that long. That is what everyone thought, Krex replied. But on the 7th day, Morrison came walking out of the caves carrying the war criminal over his shoulder. The Vorthon was alive, but he looked like he had seen the face of death itself. Morrison collected his bounty and left the planet without saying a single word to anyone. Across the station in the cargo bay section, a different group of aliens was having their own conversation about Jake Morrison. These were Kratari smugglers whose thick gray skin was covered in tattoos that told the story of their crimes. They were not afraid of much in the galaxy, but even they spoke carefully when they mentioned the Apache. I heard he once tracked a target through hyperspace, said Vorth, the leader of the smuggling crew. The target jumped to 12 different systems trying to lose him, but Morrison followed every single jump. It took him 8 months, but he never gave up. That is just a story, said another Krathari named Belk. No hunter is that persistent. After a few months, the contract money is not worth the time spent chasing one target. Vorth laughed, but it was not a happy sound. You do not understand humans, Belk. They do not think like we do. When a human decides to do something, they will keep trying until they succeed or until they die. There is no middle ground with them. The smugglers had good reason to fear Jake Morrison, because several of their friends had been captured by him over the years. The Apache did not just hunt war criminals and murderers. He also took contracts to find thieves and smugglers who had stolen from the wrong people or broken treaties with powerful organizations. Remember Jolak the Quick? Vorth asked. He thought he was so clever when he stole those Arcturian crystals from the mining consortium. He had 6 different ships and a dozen false identities, and he changed his appearance with surgical modifications. The other Krathari nodded because they all remembered Jolak. He had been one of the smartest thieves in their organization, and he had planned his crimes with great care. If anyone could have escaped from a hunter, it should have been Jolak. Morrison found him anyway, Vorth continued. He tracked down every ship, every identity, every contact that Jolak had ever used. It took him 2 years, but he followed the trail across half the galaxy until he cornered Jolak on that frozen moon in the Helix system. What the aliens did not understand was that Jake Morrison was not the monster they thought he was. They saw his success rate and his determination, and they assumed he was cruel and violent, like so many other hunters they had known. They did not know about the code that guided his actions or the reasons why he had chosen this dangerous profession. On Earth, in the desert of Arizona, where red rocks rose like ancient monuments under the endless sky, Jake Morrison sat on the porch of his adobe home and read the contract that had just arrived through encrypted channels. The message was short and direct, like most bounty contracts, but something about it made him uncomfortable. The target was a human woman named Dr. Maria Santos, who was described as a dangerous criminal fleeing from Zephyrian justice. The coordinates provided would lead him to her crash site, and the payment offered was enough to cover his sister's medical expenses for the next 2 years. Jake was a tall man with dark skin that spoke of his Apache heritage and black hair that he kept tied back in a traditional style. His grandfather had taught him the old ways before the old man died, and those teachings had guided Jake through military service and into his current profession. The most important lesson was that a warrior protects the innocent and defends those who cannot defend themselves. But the galaxy did not understand this about Jake Morrison. They saw a human who never failed to complete his contracts, and they assumed he was motivated by greed or bloodlust. They did not know that he carefully chose which contracts to accept and that he had turned down more jobs than he had taken. The aliens told stories about his ruthlessness, but they did not mention that Jake always brought his targets back alive when possible. They spoke of his persistence, but they did not understand that he kept hunting because he believed in justice. They feared his efficiency, but they did not know that he spent weeks studying each case to make sure he was pursuing the right person. Jake looked at the contract again, and something still felt wrong about it. Dr. Maria Santos had no criminal record in any database he could access. Her background showed work as a xenobiologist and researcher with several universities and space exploration organizations. Nothing in her history suggested she was the kind of person who would commit serious crimes. The Zephyrians had provided very little information about what crime she was supposed to have committed. They mentioned violations of sacred laws, but they did not explain what those laws were or how she had broken them. In Jake's experience, legitimate law enforcement agencies always provided detailed information about the crimes their fugitives had committed. Jake stood up from his chair and walked into his house to begin preparing for the hunt. His home was a mix of traditional Apache design and modern security technology. The walls were thick adobe that would stop most weapons, and the windows were reinforced with transparent metal. Hidden sensors watched every approach to the property, and automatic defenses could be activated with a thought. But inside, the house felt warm and welcoming. Traditional blankets hung on the walls next to modern communication equipment. A rifle that had belonged to his grandfather sat in a place of honor next to high-tech tracking devices. The kitchen smelled of coffee and fry bread, and there were pictures of Jake's sister Katie scattered around the living room. Jake gathered his equipment with the careful attention to detail that had kept him alive through dozens of dangerous hunts. His weapons were clean and ready, and his tracking gear was tested and calibrated. Everything he might need was packed into a single bag that he could carry for days without fatigue. As he prepared to leave for the coordinates the Zephyrians had provided, Jake tried to push away the feeling that something was very wrong with this contract. The money was too good, and the information was too vague, and Dr. Maria Santos did not seem like the kind of person who would be running from justice, but his sister needed the medical treatments that this money would buy, and Jake had learned not to question his clients too closely. Sometimes it was better not to know all the details about why someone wanted a particular person found. His job was to track and capture, not to judge whether the charges were fair. The black ship that would carry him to his target was hidden in a cave near his house, and it was equipped with everything he needed for extended hunts. As Jake started the engines and prepared to lift off, he made a decision that would change everything. Instead of simply tracking down Dr. Maria Santos and turning her over to the Zephyrians, he would find out for himself what kind of person she really was. After all, his grandfather had taught him that understanding your prey was the most important part of any hunt. The escape pod hit the desert floor with enough force to crack the hull and send up a cloud of red dust that could be seen for kilometers in every direction. Maria felt her body slam against the restraints as the pod bounced twice before finally coming to rest against a large boulder. The emergency system screamed warnings at her in 3 different languages while sparks flew from damaged control panels. Maria's head pounded, and her left shoulder felt like it might be dislocated, but she was alive. She unstrapped herself from the pilot's seat with shaking hands and tried to assess the damage to both herself and the pod. The main engine was completely destroyed, and the communication array was sending out nothing but static. Worse yet, the water recycling system had been damaged in the crash and was leaking precious fluid onto the desert sand. Through the cracked window, Maria could see nothing but endless desert stretching in every direction under a sun that burned white-hot in the clear blue sky. She had studied Earth geography during her xenobiology training, but she had never actually been to the planet before. The heat radiating through the damaged hull told her that she was somewhere very hot and very dry and very far from any help. The emergency beacon was still working, and its red light blinked steadily as it sent out a distress signal to anyone who might be listening. Maria knew that Jake Morrison would be monitoring for exactly this kind of signal, and that it would lead him directly to her location. She estimated that she had maybe 6 hours before he arrived, and she spent those hours preparing herself to die. Maria had heard enough stories about the Apache to know that he did not show mercy to his targets. The aliens who hired him expected results, and they did not care how those results were achieved. She tried to make peace with the fact that her life was about to end in this empty place so far from home and family. When she finally heard the sound of an engine approaching across the desert, Maria closed her eyes and tried to think about all the children she had saved during her time on the Zephyrian homeworld. At least some good had come from her work, even if she would not live to see those children grow up into healthy adults. Jake Morrison's black vehicle came over a ridge like a predator stalking its prey, and Maria watched through the window as it approached her damaged pod. The vehicle was sleek and dangerous looking, with weapons mounted on its sides and armor plating that could probably stop anything short of a direct missile hit. It moved across the rough terrain as if the rocks and sand were smooth pavement. The vehicle stopped about 50 meters away from the crash site, and for several long minutes, nothing happened. Maria imagined Jake Morrison studying the situation and planning his approach. She had heard that he was very careful and methodical in everything he did, and that he never rushed into a situation without understanding all the risks. Finally, the door of the vehicle opened and a man stepped out into the blazing desert sun. Maria got her first look at the legendary Apache, and she was surprised by what she saw. He was tall and lean, with dark skin and black hair tied back in a traditional style. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who was completely comfortable in dangerous situations, but there was something else about him that she had not expected. Jake Morrison did not look like a monster. He looked like someone who might have been a teacher or a doctor in another life. His face was serious but not cruel, and his eyes were alert but not filled with the cold hatred she had seen in so many bounty hunters. When he walked toward the crashed pod, he carried a water container in one hand and a medical kit in the other. Maria's confusion grew as Jake approached the pod without drawing any weapons. She had expected him to blast open the door and drag her out at gunpoint, but instead he knocked politely on the damaged hull and called out in a voice that was surprisingly gentle. "Dr. Santos, my name is Jake Morrison and I am here to help you," he said. "I can see that your pod took some damage in the crash and you are probably hurt and dehydrated. I have water and medical supplies if you need them." Maria stared at the man through the window and wondered if this was some kind of trick. Maybe Jake Morrison liked to play with his victims before he killed them. Maybe he wanted her to trust him so that her death would be more painful when it finally came. "I know you are probably afraid of me," Jake continued. "You have every right to be afraid. But right now you need medical attention and water more than you need to worry about what comes next. Let me help you and then we can talk about the rest." Something in his voice made Maria believe that he was telling the truth. Against all logic and everything she had heard about the Apache, she reached over and activated the door release mechanism. The pod's door hissed open and hot desert air rushed in carrying the smell of sage and creosote and ancient stone. Jake Morrison looked at her with dark eyes that seemed to see everything and understand more than most people ever did. He studied her face and her posture and the way she held her injured shoulder, and she could see him making quick assessments about her condition. "You have a dislocated shoulder," he said without being asked, "and probably a concussion from the impact. When did you last have water?" "This morning," Maria replied and was surprised by how hoarse her voice sounded. "Before they put me in the pod." Jake nodded and handed her the water container. "Drink slowly," he said. "Too much too fast will make you sick." The water was cool and clean and tasted better than anything Maria had ever drunk in her life. She forced herself to take small sips even though she wanted to drink the entire container at once. Jake watched her carefully and she could see him noting how much she drank and how her body responded to the hydration. "I need to reset your shoulder," Jake said after she had drunk about half the water. "It is going to hurt, but the longer we wait, the more difficult it will become." Maria nodded and tried to prepare herself for the pain. She had some medical training and she knew that a dislocated shoulder needed to be treated quickly, or it could cause permanent damage. What she did not expect was how gentle Jake Morrison would be as he positioned her arm and prepared to reset the joint. "On 3, Jake said. 1, 2. He reset the shoulder on 2 instead of 3, and Maria bit back a scream as the joint popped back into place. The pain was intense, but it faded quickly and she could feel her arm starting to work properly again. Jake held her steady until the worst of the pain passed, and then he helped her put on a sling to support the injured shoulder. "Better?" he asked. "Much better," Maria replied. "Thank you." Jake studied her face again and she could see puzzlement in his expression. "Dr. Santos, I need to ask you something and I want you to tell me the truth. What exactly did you do that made the Zephyrians want you dead?" The question caught Maria off guard because she had expected Jake Morrison to simply complete his contract without asking questions. Most bounty hunters did not care about the details of their target's supposed crimes. They just wanted to collect their payment and move on to the next job. "I helped sick children," Maria said. "Children that the Zephyrians call untouchables because they have genetic conditions that make them different from other Zephyrians." Jake was quiet for a long moment and Maria could see him, thinking about what she had told him. She decided to tell him the whole story because she had nothing left to lose, and maybe if he understood what had really happened, he would make her death quick and painless. "The Zephyrians believe that these children are cursed by their gods," Maria continued. "Instead of treating their medical conditions, they lock them away in underground chambers and let them die slowly from diseases that could be easily cured. I could not watch children suffer when I had the knowledge and tools to help them. So you treated them anyway," Jake said. "Yes," Maria replied. "I saved over 100 children during the 6 months before they caught me. I know that I broke their laws, but I could not let innocent children die when I could save them." Jake Morrison looked at her for a long time without saying anything. Maria watched his face and tried to understand what he was thinking. She had told him the truth and now she would find out whether the Apache was the monster that everyone said he was, or something different entirely. "Dr. Santos," Jake finally said, "I think there has been a misunderstanding about this contract." "What do you mean?" Maria asked. "The Zephyrians hired me to find you," Jake explained. "They said you were a dangerous criminal fleeing from justice. They did not tell me that your crime was saving sick children. Maria felt a spark of hope, but she tried not to let it grow too strong. Does that change anything? You still need to complete your contract and collect your payment. Jake Morrison smiled, and it was the first time Maria had seen any expression other than serious concentration on his face. The smile transformed him from a dangerous hunter into someone who looked like he might have been a good friend in other circumstances. Dr. Santos, he said, there are some contracts that a man just cannot complete and still look at himself in the mirror. This is one of those contracts. But what about your reputation? Maria asked. Everyone says that Jake Morrison never fails to complete a job. Everyone says a lot of things about me, Jake replied. Most of them are not true. The truth is that I choose my contracts very carefully, and I only hunt people who deserve to be hunted. You are not one of those people. Jake stood up and extended his hand to help Maria out of the... Jake's home sat in a valley between red sandstone cliffs that rose like ancient guardians against the desert sky. The house was built from adobe bricks that matched the color of the surrounding rocks, and it seemed to grow from the earth itself rather than being imposed upon it. Solar panels glinted on the roof, and Maria could see the subtle lines of defensive systems built into the natural landscape. As they approached the house in Jake's vehicle, Maria noticed how carefully everything had been planned. The single road leading to the property wound between rocks that would provide cover for defenders and obstacles for attackers. Hidden sensors probably watched every approach, and the cliffs offered excellent positions for long-range weapons. Your grandfather taught you well, Maria said as she studied the tactical advantages of the location. Jake glanced at her with surprise. How did you know my grandfather taught me anything? The way you move, the way you observe everything around you, the respect you show for the land, Maria replied. These are not things you learn in military training alone. Someone who loved you taught you the old ways when you were young. Jake was quiet for a moment as he parked the vehicle near the house. His name was Joseph Running Bear Morrison. He was the last of our family to grow up on the reservation before it was dissolved. He taught me that a warrior's strength comes not from his weapons, but from his understanding of right and wrong. And what does your understanding tell you about the Zephyrian contract? Maria asked. That someone is lying, Jake replied. Either you are not the person they described, or they are not the victims they claim to be. I intend to find out which. The inside of Jake's house was a comfortable mix of traditional and modern elements. Hand-woven rugs covered polished concrete floors, and traditional pottery sat next to high-tech communication equipment. The walls were thick enough to stop most small arms fire, but they were decorated with family photographs and Apache, artwork that made the space feel like a home rather than a fortress. Jake showed Maria to a guest room that had its own bathroom and a window that looked out over the desert, toward distant mountains. The bed was covered with a quilt that looked handmade, and there were clean clothes in the closet that would fit her reasonably well. Rest for a few hours, Jake said. When you feel better, we can talk about what really happened on the Zephyrian homeworld. Maria wanted to tell him everything immediately, but exhaustion was catching up with her, and the soft bed looked more inviting than anything she had seen in months. She lay down, still wearing the sling that supported her injured shoulder, and fell asleep almost instantly. When she woke up, the sun was setting and the western sky was painted in shades of red and gold that took her breath away. She had never seen a sunset on Earth before, and she understood why Jake had chosen to make his home in this beautiful place. The harsh landscape had a wild beauty that spoke to something deep in the human soul. She found Jake in the kitchen preparing a simple meal of grilled meat and vegetables with bread that smelled like it had been baked that morning. He moved around the kitchen with the same quiet efficiency she had seen in everything else he did, and she realized that he approached cooking with the same attention to detail that he brought to tracking fugitives. How is your shoulder? Jake asked without looking up from the stove. Much better, Maria replied. Thank you for the pain medication. I have not slept that well in weeks. When did you last have a real meal? Jake asked as he set plates on a small table near the window. Not since before the trial, Maria said. The Zephyrians were not concerned with my comfort while I was in their custody. They ate in comfortable silence while the last light faded from the western sky and stars began to appear overhead. The food was simple but perfectly prepared, and Maria realized that she had been living on emergency rations and prison food for so long that she had forgotten what real cooking tasted like. Tell me about the children, Jake said when they had finished eating. Maria told him everything. She described her arrival on the Zephyrian homeworld and her excitement at the chance to study an advanced alien medical system. She explained how she discovered the untouchables and the horrific conditions in which they were kept. She talked about the first child she treated, a little boy whose genetic condition made his bones brittle, but who smiled at her with such trust that she knew she could not walk away. The Zephyrians have convinced themselves that helping these children would anger their gods, Maria said, but I studied their religious texts, and there is nothing in them that requires children to suffer. The prohibition against treating the untouchables was created by political leaders who wanted to maintain social control. Jake listened without interrupting, and Maria could see him processing everything she told him. She had learned to read people during her years working with different alien species, and she could tell that Jake was not just listening to her words but evaluating her character and motivations. How many children did you save? Jake asked. 117, Maria replied without hesitation. I kept careful records because I knew that someday I might need to justify my actions. Each child had a specific condition that required a different treatment approach, but all of them could be helped with basic medical intervention. And now those children are healthy? Most of them, Maria said. Some required ongoing treatment that they probably will not receive now that I am gone. I tried to train a few Zephyrian medical workers who were sympathetic to the children, but they were too afraid of the authorities to continue the work. Jake was quiet for a long time as he considered what Maria had told him. She watched his face and saw anger growing in his dark eyes, but she knew the anger was not directed at her. The Zephyrians lied to me, Jake finally said. They told me you were a dangerous criminal who had committed serious crimes against their society. They did not mention that your crime was healing sick children. Does that change your plans? Maria asked. Completely, Jake replied. I do not hunt people for doing the right thing. In fact, I usually hunt people for doing exactly the opposite. Maria felt relief wash over her, but she also felt confusion. But what about your contract? What about the money they promised you? Jake's expression hardened, and Maria saw something dangerous flicker in his eyes. The Zephyrians can keep their blood money. I have other ways to get the funds I need. Other ways? There are always criminals who need to be brought to justice, Jake said. War criminals, slavers, people who hurt children for profit. The galaxy is full of them, and many of them have large bounties on their heads. Over the following days, Maria learned more about Jake Morrison than all the stories and rumors had ever revealed. She discovered that he was not the cold-blooded killer that aliens across the galaxy feared, but a man who had chosen a dangerous profession for very personal reasons. Jake's sister Katie was dying from a rare genetic condition that required expensive treatments not covered by standard medical insurance. The money Jake earned from bounty hunting paid for experimental therapies that kept Katie alive, but the treatments had to be administered regularly, or she would deteriorate rapidly. I could have chosen other work, Jake explained as they sat on his porch watching the stars. But nothing else pays enough to cover Katie's medical bills. Bounty hunting gives me the income I need, and it lets me remove dangerous people from the galaxy at the same time. But now you have lost a major contract because of me, Maria said. I am sorry that helping me will cost your sister the treatment she needs. Jake smiled, and Maria was surprised by how much warmth was in that expression. Dr. Santos helping you is not going to cost Katie anything. If anything, it might help her more than any bounty ever could. I do not understand. You are a xenobiologist with expertise in genetic conditions, Jake said. Katie's condition is genetic. Maybe you could look at her medical records and see if there are treatment options that her doctors have missed. Maria felt excitement growing in her chest. After weeks of feeling helpless and condemned, Jake was offering her the chance to use her skills to help someone who truly needed it. I would be honored to help your sister, Maria said. Do you have her medical files here? Jake nodded and led her into his study where he kept detailed records of Katie's condition and treatments. As Maria reviewed the files, she began to see patterns that Katie's doctors had apparently missed. The condition was rare but not unknown, and there were treatment protocols that had been developed on other worlds that might be much more effective than what Katie was currently receiving. Jake, Maria said after studying the records for several hours, I think I can help your sister. In fact, I think I can do much more than just help her. What do you mean? I think I can cure her. For the first time since she had met him, Maria saw Jake Morrison's careful composure crack. Hope and fear warred in his expression as he tried to process what she had just told him. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I would need to examine her and run some tests," Maria replied. "But based on these records, Katie has a condition that I have successfully treated in several other species. The treatment is complex and it takes time, but it has a very high success rate." Jake sat down heavily in his chair and Maria could see his hands shaking slightly. Katie Morrison arrived 3 days later in a medical transport that landed on the flat area behind Jake's house, where he normally parked his hunting vehicle. Maria watched through the window as Jake helped his sister out of the transport, and she was shocked by how frail the young woman appeared. Katie was tall like her brother, but where Jake was lean and strong, Katie looked like a strong wind might blow her away. But when Katie smiled at Jake and hugged him carefully, Maria could see the strength that lived inside the failing body. This was someone who had been fighting for her life for years and who had never given up hope. Her eyes were bright with intelligence and humor, and when she looked around at the desert landscape, her face showed the same love for this place that Maria had seen in Jake. "So you are the doctor who has my brother all excited," Katie said, when Jake brought her into the house. Her voice was soft but clear, and she moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to work within the limits of a body that did not always cooperate. "I am Maria Santos," Maria replied. "Your brother has told me so much about you." "All good things, I hope," Katie said with a laugh. "Jake tends to exaggerate when he talks about family. He told me you are the smartest person he knows and that you never complain even when you are in pain," Maria said. "If that is exaggeration, then I would like to meet the real Katie Morrison." Katie laughed again, and Maria could see why Jake loved his sister so much. Even weakened by illness, Katie had a warmth and spirit that filled the room. She was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel better, just by being present. Over the next few days, Maria conducted a thorough examination of Katie's condition, while Jake hovered nearby like a protective guardian. Maria could understand his concern because Katie was clearly getting worse, despite the expensive treatments she had been receiving. Her body was slowly shutting down, and without intervention, she probably had less than a year to live. But as Maria studied Katie's genetic profile and compared it to cases she had treated on other worlds, she became more convinced that the condition could be cured. The problem was that Katie's human doctors were treating the symptoms rather than addressing the underlying genetic cause of the disease. "The treatment I am proposing is not experimental," Maria explained to both Jake and Katie as they sat around the kitchen table reviewing her findings. "I have used this approach successfully with Altarian children who had a very similar condition. The genetic markers are almost identical." "What does the treatment involve?" Katie asked. She was taking notes in a small notebook, and Maria could see that she understood the medical terminology better than most patients would. "Gene therapy combined with targeted medication and some lifestyle changes," Maria replied. "The gene therapy will correct the underlying genetic defect and the medication will help your body rebuild the damaged systems. The lifestyle changes will support your recovery and prevent relapses." Katie looked at her brother, and Maria could see the hope and fear in both their faces. They had been fighting this disease for so long that the possibility of a cure seemed almost too good to be true. "How long would the treatment take?" Jake asked. "Several months for the full course," Maria said. "But you should start seeing improvement within the first few weeks. The gene therapy needs time to work, and your body will need time to heal the damage that has already been done." "And the success rate?" Katie asked. 97%, Maria replied. "In the cases where it did not work, the patients had waited too long and the damage was too extensive to reverse. Based on your current condition, I believe you are an excellent candidate for complete recovery." Katie was quiet for a long moment as she absorbed this information. Maria could see her evaluating the risks and benefits with the careful logic of someone who had learned to make life and death decisions about her own medical care. "When can we start?" Katie finally asked. Maria smiled and felt a warmth in her chest that she had not experienced since she was forced to leave the Zephyrian children behind. "We can start immediately if you are ready. I have most of the equipment I need, and Jake can help me acquire anything else we require." The treatment began the next day, and Maria was amazed by how well Katie tolerated the initial procedures. The gene therapy required several injections of modified viruses that would carry the corrected genetic information to Katie's cells. Most patients found the process uncomfortable, but Katie faced it with the same quiet courage that had carried her. Through years of illness, Jake stayed close during every procedure, and Maria could see how much he loved his sister. He held Katie's hand during the painful parts and told her stories about their childhood to distract her from the discomfort. Maria realized that these two people had been each other's entire family for years, and that their bond was stronger than anything she had ever seen. As the days passed, Maria found herself becoming part of their family circle. Katie was fascinated by Maria's stories of working with different alien species, and she asked intelligent questions about xenobiology that showed her quick mind. Jake included Maria in their evening conversations, and she began to feel like she belonged in this house in the desert. "You know," Katie said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, "I have never seen Jake relax the way he does when you are around." "What do you mean?" Maria asked. "Jake has been taking care of me for so long that he has forgotten how to take care of himself," Katie explained. "He is always worried about my health, always planning how to pay for my treatments, always thinking 3 steps ahead to prevent problems. But with you here, he seems more at peace." Maria looked at Jake, who was tending the small fire he had built in a metal ring near the porch. She had noticed that he did seem more relaxed than she would have expected from someone with his reputation. The careful wariness was still there, but it was tempered by something that looked like contentment. "I think he likes having someone around who can take care of herself," Katie continued. "And maybe someone who can take care of others too." 3 weeks into Katie's treatment, Maria received confirmation that the therapy was working. Katie's blood tests showed dramatic improvement, and her energy levels were increasing daily. The genetic markers that indicated disease progression were disappearing and being replaced by signs of healthy cellular regeneration. "I cannot believe how much better I feel," Katie said as she helped Maria prepare dinner. It was the first time in months that Katie had been strong enough to stand and work for an extended period. "It is like my body is remembering how to be healthy again." Jake watched his sister move around the kitchen with growing amazement. The change in Katie was visible not just in her improved health but in her entire demeanor. She was laughing more often, and her eyes had lost the careful look of someone who expected bad news at any moment. But their happiness was interrupted when Jake's security system detected movement on the eastern approach to the property. Multiple vehicles were heading toward the house, and they were not trying to hide their presence. Jake's expression immediately shifted into the alert focus that Maria had learned to recognize as his hunting mode. "Zephyrians?" Maria asked. "Has to be," Jake replied as he checked his weapons and activated the house's defensive systems. "They probably got tired of waiting for confirmation that you were dead." Katie looked from her brother to Maria with understanding in her eyes. "They are here for Maria, are they not?" "Yes," Jake said simply. "But they are not going to take her." "Jake, you cannot fight an entire Zephyrian military unit," Maria said. "There are too many of them, and they have superior technology." Jake smiled, and Maria saw something dangerous and predatory in his expression. "Dr. Santos, you have been studying alien biology, but I have been studying alien tactics. The Zephyrians are excellent at conventional warfare, but they do not understand guerrilla fighting. This is my land, and I know every advantage it offers." "What about Katie?" Maria asked. "She cannot be involved in a firefight." "Actually," Katie said with a smile that reminded Maria of her brother's predatory grin, "I think I can help more than you realize. I have been Jake's communications coordinator for years, and I know his defensive systems better than anyone except Jake himself." Maria realized that she was not just dealing with Jake Morrison, the legendary hunter. She was dealing with the Morrison family, and they had been preparing for this kind of fight for years. Katie might be physically weak, but her mind was sharp, and she understood tactics as well as anyone Maria had ever met. "What do you need me to do?" Maria asked. "Stay alive," Jake replied. "Whatever happens, stay alive. These people want to kill you for helping innocent children, and I will not let that happen." As the Zephyrian vehicles got closer, Maria felt something she had not expected. She felt like she was part of a family that would fight to protect her, the same way she had fought to protect the untouchable children. For the first time since her trial, she was not facing her enemies alone. The Morrison family was going to war. The 3 Zephyrian bounty hunters who approached Jake's property in the early morning hours were confident that they would complete their mission quickly and efficiently. They had studied the terrain, and they believed they understood what they were facing. One human hunter living in a primitive dwelling in an empty desert, should not present any significant challenge to trained professionals with superior technology. What they did not know was that Jake Morrison had been expecting them for days, and that every step they took toward his house was being monitored by sensors hidden among the rocks and desert plants. They also did not know that their communications were being intercepted by equipment that Katie had modified to break Zephyrian encryption codes. Jake listened to their tactical discussions through his headphones while he prepared his defensive positions. The bounty hunters were planning to surround the house and demand that Jake turn over Maria Santos. If he refused, they would use their advanced weapons to breach the walls and take her by force. "They think this is going to be easy," Jake said to Maria and Katie as they reviewed the defensive plan one more time. "They are about to learn why that assumption is a mistake." "How many of them are there?" Maria asked. 3 vehicles with 2 hunters each," Katie replied from her position at the communications console. "They have energy weapons and personal armor, but their vehicles are not heavily armored. They are designed for speed and stealth, not for sustained combat." Maria felt her stomach tighten with fear, but she also felt something else. She felt anger at these beings who had traveled across space to kill her for the crime of healing sick children. The anger gave her courage that she had not known she possessed. The first vehicle crested a ridge about a kilometer from the house and immediately came under fire from one of Jake's hidden positions. The energy blast disabled the vehicle's engine and sent it sliding sideways into a cluster of boulders. The 2 hunters inside scrambled out with their weapons ready, but they could not see where the attack had come from. "Phase 1 complete," Jake's voice said through the communication system. 2 targets neutralized, 4 remaining." The second vehicle tried to approach from the north but ran into a carefully concealed minefield that Jake had installed months earlier. The explosion flipped the vehicle completely over and left both hunters trapped underneath tons of twisted metal. They were alive, but they would not be participating in any further attacks. "Phase 2 complete," Jake reported. "Target count reduced to 2. The last vehicle stopped just outside the range of Jake's defensive perimeter, and the 2 remaining hunters began to retreat toward higher ground." Maria watched through the reinforced windows as they tried to establish a position where they could call for backup and coordinate a new attack plan. But Jake was already moving to intercept them. Maria lost sight of him as he disappeared into the maze of rocks and desert plants that surrounded his property. She knew that he was using skills his grandfather had taught him, combined with modern military training, to stalk his enemies through terrain that he knew better than anyone else in the galaxy. 20 minutes later, the shooting stopped and Jake's voice came through the communication system one final time. "All targets neutralized. No casualties on our side." When Jake returned to the house an hour later, he was carrying equipment that he had taken from the defeated bounty hunters. Most importantly, he had their communication devices and data storage units that would tell him exactly who had hired them and what other operations might be planned. "The good news is that these hunters were working independently," Jake said as he downloaded information from the captured devices. "The bad news is that they were just the first wave. The Zephyrians have a much larger operation planned." Katie studied the intercepted data while Maria looked over her shoulder. What they found made Maria's blood run cold. The Zephyrians were not just hunting her. They had identified dozens of other scientists, doctors, and researchers who had questioned Zephyrian practices over the years. All of these people were now marked for elimination. "This is not about me," Maria said as the full scope of the Zephyrian plan became clear. "This is about silencing anyone who might expose what they have been doing to their own people." "It gets worse," Katie said as she pulled up another file. "Look at this list of target locations." Maria stared at the screen and felt sick. The Zephyrians had compiled detailed information about research stations, medical facilities, and refugee centers where humans and other species provided aid to Zephyrian outcasts. All of these locations were scheduled for what the files described as cleansing operations. "They are planning genocide," Maria whispered. "Not just against the untouchables on their homeworld, but against anyone who has ever helped them." Jake's expression was grim as he studied the tactical plans that the Zephyrians had developed. "This is not a law enforcement operation. This is military conquest disguised as justice." "We have to warn the other targets," Maria said. "All of these people are in danger and they do not even know it." "Already on it," Katie replied as her fingers moved quickly across her keyboard. I am sending encrypted warnings to every location on their target list. Some of them might be able to evacuate or prepare defenses before the Zephyrians arrive. But even as Katie worked to warn the other targets, they all knew that sending warnings would not be enough. The Zephyrians had military ships and trained soldiers, while most of their targets were civilians with minimal defenses. Unless something changed dramatically, a lot of innocent people were going to die. There is something else, Jake said as he continued reviewing the captured intelligence. The Zephyrians are not working alone. They have allies from other species who share their views about genetic purity and social control. Maria felt her heart sink as she read the names of the species that had agreed to support Zephyrian operations. Some of them were governments that she had worked with during her career, and she had thought they were reasonable and civilized beings. Apparently, their commitment to civilization did not extend to protecting refugees and outcasts. Why would they support something like this? Maria asked. Because they have their own untouchables, Katie replied grimly. Every species on this list has groups within their population that they consider undesirable. If the Zephyrians succeed in eliminating outside interference, these other species can pursue their own purification programs without worrying about galactic opinion. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. This was not just about Zephyrian internal politics or even about silencing a few troublesome scientists. This was about reshaping galactic civilization to eliminate compassion and replace it with a cold efficiency that valued genetic perfection over individual lives. We cannot fight this alone, Maria said. Even if we survive the next attack, we cannot stop a conspiracy that involves dozens of species and hundreds of military ships. Maybe we do not have to fight it alone, Jake said thoughtfully. Katie, can you reach out to my network of contacts? I want to know who else is willing to stand up to this. Over the next several hours, Katie used Jake's communication network to contact human operatives throughout the galaxy. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Humans who worked as traders, mercenaries, diplomats, and researchers all reported that they had noticed increased hostility from the species involved in the conspiracy. More importantly, they were all willing to fight back. Jake, Katie said after compiling responses from over 100 human contacts, you need to see this. We are not the only ones who have figured out what is happening. The messages that Katie had received painted a picture of a coordinated human response that was already beginning to form. Traders were refusing to do business with conspiracy species. Mercenaries were declining contracts from Zephyrian allies. Diplomats were asking uncomfortable questions in galactic forums about missing scientists and refugee center attacks. It looks like the conspiracy made a critical error, Jake said with satisfaction. They assumed that humans would react to intimidation the same way other species do. They thought that if they eliminated a few troublemakers, the rest of us would fall in line and stop interfering with their plans. Instead, they just made us angry, Maria said with growing understanding. Very angry, Jake confirmed. And when humans get angry about innocent people being hurt, we do not just fight back. We organize, we plan, we make sure that the people responsible for the harm face consequences that they will never forget. As if to confirm Jake's words, Katie's communication system began receiving reports from across the galaxy. Zephyrian supply ships were experiencing mysterious mechanical failures. Conspiracy military bases were suffering from coordinated cyber attacks. Diplomatic missions were being expelled from human colonies for health and safety violations. The war has already started, Katie said with amazement. Humans everywhere are fighting back and they are not waiting for official authorization or military coordination. Maria realized that she was witnessing something that the conspiracy species had never encountered before. They were facing a species that valued individual initiative and moral responsibility over hierarchical authority. When humans decided that something was wrong, they did not wait for their governments to tell them what to do. They acted according to their own consciences and dealt with the consequences later. What the Zephyrian military vessel? Righteous. Vengeance dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system with a crew of 50 soldiers who believed they were about to complete a simple police action. Captain Zekmore had reviewed the mission briefings and concluded that overwhelming force would quickly resolve the situation. One human hunter and his primitive homestead should not require the full capabilities of a military cruiser, but the High Council wanted to send a message that would discourage other humans from interfering with Zephyrian justice. What Captain Zekmore did not understand was that his ship had been detected the moment it entered the system. Human monitoring stations throughout the solar system tracked every vessel that approached Earth, and they had been on high alert since the conspiracy was discovered. Within minutes of the Righteous Vengeance's arrival, every human military unit in the system knew that Zephyrian forces were moving toward Earth. More importantly, Jake Morrison knew they were coming. Military cruiser, approximately 50 personnel, heavily armed, Katie reported as she monitored the sensor readings from the outer system. They are not trying to hide their approach. They want us to know they are coming. Intimidation tactic, Jake replied as he made final preparations to his defensive systems. They think that if we see how outgunned we are, we will surrender without a fight. Will we surrender? Maria asked. She was trying to keep the fear out of her voice, but the thought of facing a military ship with professional soldiers was terrifying. Dr. Santos, Jake said with a smile that reminded Maria of his grandfather's warrior tradition. Surrender is not a word that exists in the Apache vocabulary. Over the past week, Jake had transformed his property into a fortress that used every advantage the desert landscape offered. Hidden weapon emplacements covered all approaches to the house. Underground tunnels connected defensive positions and provided escape routes through terrain that only Jake knew. Most importantly, he had prepared surprises that would turn the Zephyrians' technological advantages against them. But Jake was not just preparing to defend his home. He was preparing to hunt. The Zephyrians think this is going to be a siege, Jake explained to Maria and Katie as they reviewed the defensive plan one final time. They plan to surround the house and force us to surrender by cutting off our supplies and communications. What they do not realize is that I have no intention of staying trapped in one location. You are going to leave the house? Maria asked with confusion. I'm going to make them hunt me, Jake replied. But they will be hunting me on my land, by my rules, using tactics that they do not understand. Katie pulled up a holographic display that showed the terrain for 50 kilometers around the house. Red markers indicated Zephyrian landing zones and approach routes, while blue markers showed Jake's prepared positions and escape routes. The key is mobility, Katie explained. Jake will use hit-and-run tactics to pick off their forces, while avoiding direct confrontation with their main units. Every time they think they have him cornered, he will disappear into terrain that their technology cannot easily navigate. But what about us? Maria asked. Katie is still recovering from her treatments and I have no combat training. You will be safe, Jake said with absolute confidence. The house has defensive systems that can hold off anything short of a direct orbital bombardment, and Katie knows how to operate them better than I do. Your job is to stay alive and continue documenting the evidence we need to expose the conspiracy. As the Zephyrian ship approached Earth, Jake made final contact with his network of human allies throughout the galaxy. The response was immediate and coordinated. Human forces were moving to intercept Zephyrian operations on dozens of worlds, while diplomatic pressure was building in galactic forums to investigate the conspiracy. Jake, Katie said as she monitored communications from across the galaxy, you need to hear this. The humans are not just fighting back randomly, they are coordinating their efforts. The reports coming in were remarkable. Human traders had organized boycotts that were disrupting supply lines to conspiracy worlds. Human mercenaries were offering their services to refugee organizations at reduced rates. Human diplomats were presenting evidence of Zephyrian crimes to every galactic authority that would listen. Most impressively, human military forces were moving to protect the targets on the Zephyrian elimination list. Research stations and medical facilities that had been marked for destruction suddenly found themselves under the protection of heavily armed human security forces. How are they organizing so quickly? Maria asked with amazement. They are not organizing, Jake replied. They are reacting. When humans see innocent people being threatened, they do not wait for orders or permission. They just act according to their conscience and trust that other humans will do the same. But that should create chaos, Maria protested. How can they coordinate without central command? Katie smiled, and Maria could see the pride she felt in her species. Because we all learned the same values growing up. Protect the innocent, defend the helpless, stand up to bullies. When humans face a clear moral choice, they usually make the same decision even if they have never met each other. The Zephyrian ship entered Earth's atmosphere just after dawn and immediately began deploying landing craft toward Jake's location. Captain Zekmore had planned a textbook military operation with multiple approach vectors and overwhelming firepower. What he had not planned for was fighting an enemy who refused to follow conventional military doctrine. The first landing, craft touched down 5 kilometers from Jake's house and immediately came under attack from weapons that seemed to appear from the rocks themselves. The Zephyrian soldiers found themselves fighting ghosts who struck without warning and disappeared before they could respond. Contact, grid reference 77 Alpha, came the first radio report. We are taking fire from concealed positions. Cannot identify shooter location. Jake was already moving to his next position before the Zephyrians could react to the first attack. He used natural cover and pre-planned routes to stay ahead of their response teams, while picking off isolated soldiers with precision shots. This is not how the briefing said this would go. One Zephyrian soldier reported to his commander. The human is not fighting like we expected. Captain Zekmore studied the tactical displays from his command ship and felt growing frustration. His forces were taking casualties, but they could not seem to pin down their enemy long enough to bring their superior firepower to bear. Every time they thought they had Jake Morrison surrounded, he would strike from a completely different direction. Deploy the heavy assault teams, Captain Zekmore ordered. If we cannot find him, we will destroy every possible hiding place until he has nowhere left to run. But Jake had anticipated this response. As the Zephyrian heavy weapons teams moved into position, they found themselves walking into carefully prepared kill zones, where their armor and shields became liabilities rather than advantages. The narrow passages between rocks that they thought would provide cover instead became traps where their heavy weapons could not be brought to bear effectively. Sir, we are losing teams faster than we can deploy them, Jake's communication interceptor picked up from the Zephyrian command frequency. The human knows this terrain too well. We need orbital support. Negative, Captain Zekmore replied. The High Council wants the human taken alive if possible. Orbital bombardment would eliminate valuable intelligence. About human resistance networks, Katie monitored the Zephyrian communications from her position in the house, while Maria continued compiling evidence about the conspiracy. Every intercepted message provided more proof of the systematic campaign to eliminate anyone who opposed Zephyrian policies. Maria, Katie said as she reviewed the latest communications intercepts, you need to see this. The Zephyrians are not just targeting scientists and doctors. They have a list of human children who have received medical treatment from people like you. Maria felt sick as she read the files that Katie had decrypted. The conspiracy had identified human children whose lives had been saved by xenobiologists and doctors who worked with alien refugees. These children were considered contaminated by association and were marked for elimination along with their families. They want to kill children because their parents showed compassion to alien refugees, Maria said with horror. It gets worse, Katie replied. They have similar lists for every species that has offered aid to Zephyrian outcasts. This is not just about silencing critics. This is about eliminating the concept of interspecies compassion entirely. As Jake continued his guerrilla campaign against the Zephyrian ground forces, reports from across the galaxy painted a picture of a conflict that was rapidly expanding beyond anyone's control. The conspiracy species had expected quick victory through overwhelming force, but they were discovering that humans did not surrender easily. Human colonies were declaring independence from galactic authorities that supported the conspiracy. Human trade networks were reorganizing to exclude conspiracy species entirely. Most dangerously, human military forces were beginning to coordinate their scattered defensive actions into something that looked like. The sun was rising over the red rocks of Arizona when Captain Zekmore made the decision that would define the rest of his life. After losing more than half his ground forces to Jake Morrison's guerrilla tactics, the Zephyrian commander decided to abandon military protocol and end the hunt with overwhelming force. All units, fall back to minimum safe distance, Zekmore ordered through his communication system. We are going to level that entire area with orbital bombardment. But Jake Morrison had been listening to Zephyrian communications since the battle began, and he was already moving before the order was completed. He had spent the night preparing for exactly this possibility, and his response would show the galaxy the difference between Zephyrian justice and Apache justice as the Zephyrian ground forces retreated to their landing zones. Jake moved through the desert with the silent efficiency that his grandfather had taught him decades earlier. But instead of running away from the overwhelming firepower that was about to be unleashed against his home, Jake was running toward the Zephyrian command position. "Katie, initiate broadcast protocol 7, Jake said into his communication device as he approached the ridge where Captain Zekmore had established his command post. Back at the house, Katie activated the emergency broadcast system that would transmit everything that happened next to human networks throughout the galaxy. Within minutes, beings on hundreds of worlds would be watching the confrontation that was about to unfold in the Arizona desert. Jake reached the Zephyrian command position just as Captain Zekmore was preparing to give the order for orbital bombardment. The captain was standing next to his mobile command vehicle with 6 heavily armed soldiers providing security. They were all focused on their tactical displays, and none of them noticed the human hunter, who had ghosted through their perimeter like smoke. "Captain Zekmore," Jake called out in a voice that carried clearly. Across the desert air, the Zephyrians spun around with their weapons ready, but they found themselves facing a single human who was standing in the open with his rifle pointed at the ground. Jake Morrison looked like he had stepped out of an ancient story with his traditional Apache clothing and the calm confidence of a warrior who had never known fear. "I am Jake Morrison," he said simply. "I believe you have been looking for me." Captain Zekmore stared at the human who had destroyed his carefully planned military operation and felt a mixture of rage and grudging respect. This was the primitive savage who had outfought trained soldiers using nothing but knowledge of the terrain and determination that bordered on madness. "Surrender now, and you will be given a fair trial," Captain Zekmore said, as his soldiers kept their weapons trained on Jake. Jake smiled, and it was the expression of a predator who was completely comfortable with violence. "Captain, I think there has been a misunderstanding about who is surrendering to whom." Before the Zephyrians could react, the sound of approaching aircraft filled the desert air. Human military ships appeared over the horizon in perfect formation, and their weapons were already locked onto the Zephyrian vessel orbiting above. Captain Zekmore realized with growing horror that his ship was surrounded by a fleet that had appeared as if from nowhere. "This is Admiral Patricia Hayes of the Earth Defense Force," came a voice over the communication channels that every being in the galaxy could hear through Katie's broadcast. "Captain Zekmore, you are ordered to stand down immediately and prepare to be boarded for inspection." "You have no authority here," Captain Zekmore replied, but his voice carried less confidence than his words suggested. "This is a legitimate law enforcement operation authorized by the Galactic Council. The Galactic Council has been dissolved pending investigation of war crimes," Admiral Hayes replied calmly. "As of this morning, 17 member species have withdrawn from the Council and declared the Zephyrian conspiracy to be in violation of fundamental sentient rights." Jake kept his rifle pointed at the ground, but his dark eyes never left Captain Zekmore's face. "Captain, your government sent you here to kill an innocent woman who saved sick children. They told you that Dr. Maria Santos was a dangerous criminal, but they did not tell you that her crime was showing mercy to beings that your society had condemned to death. The untouchables carry divine curse," and one of the Zephyrian soldiers said with the certainty of someone repeating religious doctrine. "To heal them is to interfere with the will of our gods." "Your gods never commanded the death of children," Jake replied. "That command came from politicians who wanted to maintain power by convincing you that compassion was weakness." Through the global broadcast system, beings throughout the galaxy were hearing this conversation and learning the truth about what the conspiracy had really been planning. Maria's compiled evidence was being transmitted simultaneously, and the documentation of systematic genocide was undeniable. Captain Zekmore looked around at his soldiers and saw doubt growing in their faces. These were good beings who had believed they were serving justice, but they were beginning to understand that they had been used as tools for something much darker. "Even if what you say is true," Captain Zekmore said, "we have our orders. We cannot simply abandon our mission." "Captain," Jake said with the patience of someone who had spent years teaching difficult lessons, "a warrior's highest duty is to protect the innocent. When your orders require you to kill innocents, those orders become illegitimate. You speak of warriors, but you are just a hired killer," Captain Zekmore replied with desperation creeping into his voice. Jake smiled and gestured toward the human ships that surrounded them. Captain, take a look around you. Every human in this system volunteered to be here. No one ordered them to come. No one promised them rewards. They came because they believe that innocent people deserve protection. But why would they risk their lives for aliens they have never met? One of the Zephyrian soldiers asked with genuine confusion. Because that is what humans do, Jake replied. We protect family, and anyone who needs protection becomes family. As if to prove his point, Maria's voice came through the communication system as she spoke from the safety of Jake's house. My name is Dr. Maria Santos, and I want to tell you about the children I tried to save on the Zephyrian homeworld. For the next 30 minutes, beings throughout the galaxy listened as Maria described each of the untouchable children she had treated. She spoke about their medical conditions, their personalities, their dreams for the future. She made them real people instead of abstract concepts, and she explained how easily their conditions could be treated with basic medical care. The little girl with silver skin was named Lyra, Maria said. She wanted to be a teacher when she grew up. The boy with brittle bones was called Keth, and he loved to draw pictures of the sky he had never been allowed to see. All of them could have lived normal, healthy lives if their society had chosen compassion over prejudice. Captain Zekmore listened to Maria's testimony and felt something breaking inside his chest. He had been told that the untouchables were cursed beings who threatened the spiritual purity of Zephyrian society. But Maria was describing children who were no different from his own, offspring except for minor genetic variations that could be easily corrected. You are lying, one of his soldiers said, but the words carried no conviction. I have medical records for every child I treated, Maria replied gently. I documented their conditions, their treatments, and their recovery rates. The information is being transmitted now to medical professionals throughout the galaxy for independent verification. Jake watched Captain Zekmore's face and saw the moment when understanding replaced blind obedience. The captain was realizing that his government had sent him to kill a doctor who had saved children from preventable deaths. Captain, Jake said quietly, you have a choice to make. You can continue following orders that require you to murder innocents, or you can choose to be the warrior that your training taught you to be. If I disobey these orders, I will be branded a traitor, Captain Zekmore said. If you follow these orders, you will be a war criminal, Jake replied. The choice is yours, but you will have to live with the consequences either way. Captain Zekmore looked at his soldiers and saw his own doubts reflected in their faces. These beings had joined the military to serve their people and protect their civilization. They had not signed up to participate in genocide against children. All units stand down, Captain Zekmore finally said into his communication device. Lower your weapons and prepare for surrender. Sir? One of his soldiers asked with confusion. We were wrong, Captain Zekmore said simply. Our government lied to us about the nature of this mission. I will not be responsible for the murder of innocent children. Jake nodded with respect and finally raised his rifle to point it skyward in the traditional Apache gesture of peace. Captain, you have made the choice of a true warrior. Your ancestors would be proud. As the Zephyrian forces surrendered to the human fleet, reports were coming in from across the galaxy that the conspiracy was collapsing everywhere. Species that had supported the genocide were facing massive internal resistance as their own people learned the truth about what had been planned. Jake, Katie's voice came through the communication system. You need to hear this. The melody have